yeah, looking forward to talking about communication today in a you know, a little bit of a different way, I suppose. But all of my kind of thoughts around this have come directly out of coaching sessions. So I work with business owners on a range of different things. Always communication is at the core of that. I'm sure that's no surprise. So as per advertised, I wanted to talk about meaning, maps and egos today. So I'm going to fly through these kind of a couple of key concepts, three kind of major concepts that have come up over a dozen years of coaching constantly, and some tools and strategies that generally you know, work and that people find helpful. So let's get into that. So I'm just going to assume you can't see my speaker notes because that would be not very cool. No, cool. Okay. So the first premise is that we see things not as they are, but as we are. All right. So what that means is that we can only see things through our own filters, our own way of seeing. And this is probably not news to you, but we do often forget about that. And when it comes to communication, you know, often we think that we have, you know, started a perfectly reasonable conversation and we think we know where it's going to go, and next minute we're like, hold on, how did we get here? And often that's because we're seeing things through, you know, our own filters, and they're not the same as someone else's. So filters are a great thing to keep in mind because they're both a reason why things, you know, don't always go the way we want, but they're also an opportunity for how we can do things differently. So we're going to sort of cover both sides of that today. A little bit of, okay, that's how we get into these situations, and a little bit of, okay, that's how we can get out of these situations. So we see things not as they are, but as we are. And you'll notice throughout, I've got this first little part, I've called on some of my NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming, if you're wondering what that is. And they've got a range of presuppositions which sort of guide our way of thinking. So if you want more on that, just let me know. But that's where this comes from. So remembering that we have filters, and literally just like a camera filter, if we put the red one on, we're going to see it differently from someone who's got the green one on, and so forth, even though we might think we're talking about the same thing. So that's the first thing to kind of think about. For example, what do you see here? So I know that some of you will see a fish on a plate. Delish, lunchtime, looking good. Yep, Shani's nodding. Or you might see a lady winking at you. Okay, there's an, oh yeah, so there's, and you might see something else. Are any of you wrong? Absolutely not. It's just our filter. It's just how our eyes see that particular image. I'm only going to do one more of these, but I could do dozens because I love them. You know, you might see a young lady, an old-fashioned young lady ready to go out on the town, or you might see a very old lady who's all rugged up in her fur coat. I can see Shani's face trying to see that. It's great. Trust me, there's more than one way to see it, and that's the same with all of our communication as well. So it's not just our visual, but how we hear things and how we interpret information. All right, so we've got fun out of the way. At this point, it's really important to think about self-awareness. Okay, all of my work is focused around that in coaching, and any of you that are coaches will have experienced that as well. The self-awareness and understanding what our filters are, and that's what I'd love you to take away, if anything, from today, is just going, so what are my filters? And when we talk about these other areas, because self-awareness then leads on to a deeper conversation around emotional intelligence and the effect that that has. You know, what's our level of self-awareness? How do we manage that information? And then, you know, what ability do we have to use that in relation to others? So it impacts our communication, our relationships, and our outcomes. So as we work through these tools, I do want you to think about and remember that we can only work with what we're aware of. Okay, so we're not talking about just everyone else here, we're talking about you, and we're talking about me. So consider as we go through, so at this point, what are my filters? So I'm going to layer onto that now, and layering onto filters around that. The meaning of your communication is the response you get. If you haven't heard this before, I want you just to chunk that through, because the first time I heard this, I completely admit I was like quite confused as to what it was trying to tell me. But if we choose this to be true, that the meaning of my communication is the response I get. Yeah, it's not what I intended necessarily, but it does mean the response that I get. So if after this session the response I get is, oh, I learned so much about how other people are, then that's how I communicated it. If I get a response that says I learned nothing, then apparently that's what I communicated. So my intention is one thing, but the actual outcome will actually determine the meaning of the communication, right? So thinking about the fact that we have an intention, and that may be subconscious, that regardless of what I intended by that communication, the meaning of it is what comes back around. So if what you're communicating is not getting the outcome you want, then you might want to do something differently. And there's a power in that. So what do we do about it? Yeah. So this is another layer, which is that the person or the system, and this phrasing, with the most flexibility will end up controlling the system. So in this case, a system might be this communication that we're talking about. In an environment where we're communicating, the person who's prepared to flex the most, who's prepared to see from other points of view, who's prepared to look through other filters, who's prepared to adapt and adjust their behaviour, who's prepared to see something from another point of view, to accept other information that might be contrary to their own, they're the ones who are going to be able to impact the outcome the most. They're the ones who are going to be able to shift and learn and grow and achieve through that. So whether that might be, you know, there's a sense of responsibility that comes with that though, yeah? So we can notice, observe, and be curious about what's going on. We can reflect and rephrase what we've just said if we're getting a response that doesn't line up with what our perceived meaning is. We can do something. We might demonstrate something. We might find another way of communicating. We might ask questions, or we might use a different perspective. Okay, but to do that, we would need to be flexible. We would need to allow ourselves not to be concreted into the ideas that we had coming into a communication. Okay, that's step one. So that's all around that meaning, okay? So that meaning, how we're seeing things, what perspective do we have? But of course, there are three parts to any communication, and this is a good time to kind of remember that as well. So there's what we say, there's the response we get, and the response we expect, sorry, and then the response we actually get. And so that kind of encapsulates what we've been talking about. So keeping that in mind as we move through. So the next idea that I want to talk to you about, and it kind of marries beautifully with the sense of that meaning of the communication is the response that I get, and the filtering of things, is something called the map is not the territory. So it's another way to look at that. So, you know, those times when you're dealing with somebody and they just don't see things as you do. And it's because their map, we go to the same place, and we could have maps from two different people about how to get there or what to find when we get there, and we'll have two different experiences of the same territory. Okay, so just because we have a map of something doesn't mean we understand exactly what it is, how it looks, and what the experience is going to be about. So here's a little bit more detail on how to think about that. A lot of you were probably in businesses and organisations where you're working with people, right? That's you're servicing them in some way. And so this was really interesting to consider. So my map is made up of things like my beliefs and my values and my version of reality, yeah, my experiences, what I've been through, what I've noticed, what I've seen, who my parents were, the leaders that I've been you know, around, people I've had in my teams. That all makes up my map of a particular territory. And then when I'm communicating with you, then you have the same. Okay, so if you can think about this in relation to your customers, your team, your leaders, your partners, your children, the people, you know, at the moment there's all these other interesting communications. I'm thinking about, you know, how we're communicating with our teachers differently and all sorts of things. Everyone's version of the same environment and experience that we're having right now is determined by their set of beliefs and values, the information they have access to, their levels of stress and anxiety, the things that they worry about, which can be very different from yours. Seeing a lot of that as, you know, as the changes happening with, you know, the constrictions and restrictions are being lessened and the judgment that comes into place about who's doing what and who should be able to do what. It's because we all have a different map of the same territory. And when we're in communication, if you come all the way back down now to thinking about sort of one-on-one communication, you think about that, well, there's their map, there's my map, and what we're looking for is what's the bit in the of understanding. And if it's not obvious, then your responsibility as the leader in communication is to identify, look for that, try and find it. And sometimes it has to be a very conscious decision to do that. It's not always easy. You know, there's people that we just fall into that and go, yep, there it is. That's where we come into alignment. And then there's some people in conversations that we're in and we're like, God, I need to get out a torch to find it. All right. The first step is absolutely just being aware that that's what we're there to do. That's what we're looking for. So the map is not the territory. It's just our map. Okay, take a breath and a drink. Moving on. This is one of my favourite topics, and there's a lot of information around it, but I really wanted to introduce it today because every time I work with clients using this concept of transactional analysis, it's a real game changer in all parts of their life. So I want to introduce you to that today. So transactional analysis comes from the psychology of people and communication, and it's a model that helps us understand what we bring to a situation, and it's the ego in the thing that we talked about, that we called the session. So it talks about the ego that we bring to a situation, and the ego that we bring to a situation comes from many things as well, from our backgrounds, our experiences, what we like when we were a child, what we like now, all of these things. And we can all be in different egos at different times. I'm sure that you will have experienced that. Sometimes we're fully present, sometimes we're feeling just really narky, other times we're feeling sort of bossy, but we do have our defaults as well. So it talks about 3 different sort of ego states. The first is the parent ego state. Okay, so when we're in parent ego state, we can be either in the sort of a controlling, critiquing parent state, or we might be a nurturing parent state. So if we go through these, you start to think about, oh yeah, I know someone who does that, or that's what I default to, and I certainly default to both of these parent states at different times, and sometimes there's a value and use to them. They're not always a negative thing. The key is to be really aware of what's happening so that it can unravel what the results are that it's getting from our communication. So if we're in controlling parent, we might be very quite critical and punishing, reprimanding, and that's obviously, if we think about that in relation to children. But if you think we're talking today about adult to adult communication, then and in business, we still go into parent. Yeah, whether it's with our team, our suppliers, our customers, those times that we might sort of, in controlling or critiquing parent, go into, why would you do that? I didn't tell you to do it like that. That doesn't make any sense. I don't see it that way. Just filtering all of your stuff onto that. Or a nurturing parent, something goes wrong, or something hasn't been done right, or we're not prepared to hold people to expectations, and it's very caring and loving and nurturing and helping. And when it's not working is when we're allowing people to sort of run riot, and it's not actually helping us get to where we want to go. The other thing that happens is if we are in parent, for example, well, if I'm the parent, then of course you've got to be in child. And so one can activate the other. Okay, so someone might present themselves in child, and therefore we take the parent role, or vice versa. So we talk about having 2 sides of the child ego, one being adapted and one being free. So adapted child would be quite indignant. They might be afraid, they might be anxious. Why is it always me? There's a bit of woe is me kind of thing going on. They are a little bit victim mentality is often what we see with that as well. And then free child, well, oh really? I didn't realise we had to do that. Oh well, let's move on. Let's lots of distraction, lots of lack of ownership and things like that going on as well. So if someone comes to a situation in free child, then I might just be like, oh, nurturing parent. Oh yeah, okay, no, don't worry about it. Or start critiquing while they're doing something. So what happens is when we find that we're in one of these ego states, it's difficult for us to progress. It's difficult for us to leave the conversation feeling like we've actually achieved anything. And certainly when we're talking about being in business, it is kind of distracting for us to find that we're in these ego states. And of course, what is in the middle is adult, is logic. This is where we want to be if we want to get moving forward. So if we've got someone who's deep into a child state, we might have to engage our parent for a moment there and go, okay, what's it going to take to pull them through to adult? All right, so that's an active state that you need to be in. And the best way to get through through that process is acknowledging, okay, what's going on here? Oh, okay, gosh, they're really in critical parent right now. What do I need to bring them back into logic? So logic is all about numbers and facts and black and white and, specificity versus generalization. So we can talk about some examples of that, which would be, okay, so tell me some more about that. What would you specifically like to happen next? How do you feel that we should go, forward from here? So bringing things back in. So this is an area that first step is self-awareness. So who am I being? Okay, well, we know that a communication isn't happening how it needs to. Who am I being? And then moving forward, who are they being? And then who do we want to be? Who do we need to be to get the result that we're looking for here? So that's a little bit about transactional analysis. So coming back and thinking about those three parts to each communication. So what we say, what's our activated ego state? What are we bringing to it, for example? And, if we were to take a couple of moments, just a few moments before we entered into any kind of communication and checked in with that, might be surprised and we might have opportunity just to adapt, adjust, or just acknowledge that so we know what we're coming to the party with. And then, of course, there's what are we expecting to receive? So maybe be aware of that, knowing ahead of time, what do I think is going to happen here? And is that reasonable? And am I bringing what I need to bring in terms of myself, my filters, my ego, my map of the territory that's going to allow that to happen? And how stuck on that am I? What sort of flexibility am I bringing with me? Because then there's the actual response that you receive that may or may not be in line with what you thought. But if we have that level of awareness, we're able to make those adjustments along the way. So that was a super fast version of communication. And more than happy to talk through any kind of, any questions around that or go through any examples. But yes, so just to summarise, we had our meaning. The meaning of the communication is the response we get. That person with the flexibility will have the ability to really shift and change the results that we want. And then our what kind of ego are we bringing to things as well? So yeah, thanks, Lauren. I don't know how long. Oh, there you go, 20 minutes.